We think that there's potential to kind of address some of these issues that are very clearly things that students are finding challenging, as we all are. We're all finding these issues of polarization and like, I mean, there are presidents and people of authority who are very openly causing divides between people in order to get elected, or whatever the case may be. There are so many different scenarios. So how do we bridge those gaps? How do we make it so that we understand the differences between these people are not necessarily removing their humanity, that on some level we can kind of connect? And this is kind of what is interesting about, I think is interesting, is that there's nothing really that's taboo. So students know that they can talk about rape, they can talk about racism, they can talk about those things if they're kind of in our classes for those who are using this pedagogy. But then there's this other thing too, where it's not taboo to talk about, for example, a perpetrator of rape culture. In fact, that's kind of what is important, I think, and is missing in the conversation a lot of the time, is that sometimes what we have to recognize, I think, is that if we're in front of a group of 30, 40, 50 people, depending on what kind of course you're teaching, oftentimes, like, I think we have to recognize that there's a good percentage that has, on some level, or some people are survivors or victims of sexual assault. But then there's this other element of it, which is that, yeah, there are perpetrators in the room, and they perhaps don't even know that they're perpetrators. And where our role is to figure out how to make sure that they're learning something as well, and that they're not learning just based on what those who have survived sexual assault are saying, but also from us, right? So how can we find ways to kind of bridge those gaps? Because in some instances, particularly in our case with 17, 18-year-olds, people don't know that they're perpetrating sexual violence in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. And on another level, there might be that person or a couple of people in the room who are both of those things. Perhaps they are survivors and are perpetrators. And coming to realize that is a very difficult, heavy thing. Do we take on the role of psychologists in the classroom? Of course not. But what we do, hopefully do, is kind of set them on a path where perhaps students can kind of address these things without feeling that they have lost their agency, that they can, in fact, kind of address these things and be who they are, like they're a work in progress, right? Like we all are, right? And that societies are, etc. So I think that we're trying on some level, through looking at historical examples, looking at the way people used to look at rape versus the way it's looked at now, just legally, is very interesting, right? The laws related to how women were perceived and how there was no such thing as domestic rape, prior to there being a word for it. That rape just on some level, like discussing all of these things. And then also allowing for the element of surprise to enter into the classroom through artwork, right? Like if there's an artistic activist who's making work, and suddenly there's this happened in my class recently, someone, it's just a drawing of panties, right? And it says, "This isn't consent." And you've got the guy giggling in the back because he doesn't necessarily know that this isn't funny. But then you've got the other people in the classroom who are kind of like, oh, okay, this is very serious, and yeah, this isn't consent, and let me teach you about, like this kind of thing. How do we kind of work together to make it so that both of these extremes have some kind of way of connecting to that, and then be able to deconstruct it and analyze it in an intelligent way? So all of that comes into play in these courses. And we find that using, if we use nonviolence as a base, like the concepts around nonviolence, so working with trying to see those who we have kind of labeled as the other, or the person who is bad or whatever, as a human being, and trying to find ways, not necessarily to be an ally, but perhaps a way to kind of understand their reality a little bit. If we kind of work in those kind of elements of surprise with artwork, in this case, in my case a lot, that's I rely on that a lot, and we kind of bring up things before people shut down. So bring up kind of like ideas before the anger comes in and the denial comes in about like, that's not me, that's, you know, if we can kind of try to do that more regularly in the classroom, then it actually opens up the conversation and people feel perhaps a little less like they have to perform something. You know what I mean? Or they feel maybe a little less like there's a right answer. If everyone is gasping at whatever is being shown on the screen, or they're laughing because, you know, they thought it was funny, but then after they realize, oh, maybe it wasn't as funny, you know, we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to understand all of this. So yeah, I feel like I'm being a little long-winded with this, but I'm very passionate about it, and it's something that we've seen kind of works. Like it's something that has allowed for students to I think go the path that they need to kind of open up that opportunity for discussion and that opportunity for learning in a way that isn't shut down by a lot of the very kind of like what we see often, I think, when we start talking about these things, like, oh, okay, is she really going to talk about sexism again? Or, you know what I mean? Like, clearly she's a gender studies teacher, so she's going to talk about that, you know? So by doing it this way and following kind of some of the lessons that nonviolence has to teach us, we found that it's very productive and very, very helpful, I think, for learning.